that is fine. Now, for both of you, I'm going to do an opening statement, then we're going to go first to you, Jim, and then to you, Paul, for specific questions. Here's my larger concern. I'd like both of you to address it. And we'll start with Jim, you addressing it first. I believe today that many of our major institutions, and in fact, the majority of our paradigms, have betrayed us. I believe that our educational institutions today, our political institutions, many of our cultural institutions, many of the NGOs, our think tanks, not all by any means, but enough of them that concerns me. Our financial institutions, our medical industrial complex, our national security state complex, our energy cartel complex, the farming big agri complex, our insurance and health providing complex. When I look at the areas of our lives, and even our religious institutions, too many of these have an agenda that works exactly opposite to our authentic needs. Now, the media is not covering any of this. And unfortunately, even some of the left media has aligned itself, especially with the military-industrial complex. So right now, for example, one very popular program, but not a large audience, the public would be shocked to see how small the audience is, but I get the arbitrons and I see, is supporting, as they did with the invasion in North Africa of Libya, now they're supporting, an intervention into Syria, without realizing that there's another larger story. They don't have any knowledge of how many people in Syria are. The majority of the people in the Arab world are Sunni. How many are Shia? How many are Shia in Syria? What this does to the body politic there? They just say they're killing civilians. They're bad. It's all one side. Go after them. And in that case, and I believe that they betray the power they've been given to properly and intelligently and with some sense of scholarship do their homework and inform the public. I believe many times that's not the case. So that's the larger picture. And, oh, by the way, let me not exclude the media from this as well. So first, Jim, your thoughts on the power within these major institutions, and what does that power do when it has been pathologized?
Well, that's a very deep question, Gary, and thank you for asking it, because I think that question really strikes to the heart of the pathology in the United States today and the pervasive corruption in politics of money and the inability of our civic institutions and our governing institutions to really take on serious challenges like climate change, for example, and a myriad of other challenges. My view on this is really shaped as a historian. And my last book was called America as Empire, in which I looked at the United States in the Bush-Obama administrations from the vantage point of the rise and fall of imperial systems. Over the span of history, there have been dozens and dozens of empires. Most of them haven't lasted a very long time. Some, like Rome, have lasted an inordinately long time. And so there is what historians call the imperial arc of empire. And without going into a lot of detail about that, I would just say two things. One is, after an empire has reached its apogee moment, the only real question it has to ask is how long it's going to last before it falls. And how it builds an empire is very different than how it maintains an empire. And basically, what determines, broadly speaking, the longevity of an imperial system is its capacity to develop governing institutions that the governed fundamentally experience as fair. And that's what gives stability to a country, a community, even a family, if people basically believe that the way they're doing business and the way they're interacting with each other is fundamentally fair. Now, two things happen at the demise of an imperial system, which I think are important to note in thinking about the United States today, because they go to the heart of your question. If you look at the decline and fall of Rome, and you look at the decline and fall of almost every empire that we have in recorded history, two things happen simultaneously. One is that at a certain point, governing power and financial power are increasingly concentrated into fewer and fewer individuals. In Rome, we went from a republic to the Caesar. And with the concentration of political power was a concentration of financial power. And what that does in any system, including an imperial system, is it creates elites and a vast underclass that is increasingly alienated from the very institutions that the elites are using to govern. The second fundamental aspect of a decline and fall of an imperial system, which you see rampantly in the United States today, is the exchange of what I would call civic virtue for personal entitlement. I mean, if you think about, for example, the United States, what built our country? We had a Puritan ethic. You know, we worked hard, and we had civic virtues, and it was their patriotism was real, and the notion of the United States as the light to the world was a reality in people's mind. And because that was real, people from all over the world flocked to these shores. What do you see today? You see very little civic virtue. You see massive personal entitlement. It's not what I can do for my country. It's what I can get out of whatever situation I'm in with very little regard to morality. So I would say that if you look at the United States today within the context of the rise and fall of imperial systems, you'll find that we have passed our apogee moment. We are in a state of increasing corruption, where the civic institutions are increasingly irresponsive, unresponsive to community needs, where the financial and governing elites are increasingly rapacious and unconcerned with the social welfare, and which the mass majority of the people are eking an existence alienated from the very institutions by which they're governed. So I'll just keep it at that so we can hear from Paul, but that's a historical view that I think, for me, greatly aids in understanding the current collapse of the American civic institutional system.
I appreciate that introductory overview, Jim. Paul, Ray, I'd like you to address the same issue, but I'm going to add one more area, if you would please, to discuss, and that is, it's one thing to have power. It's another thing for someone to assume that you are going to engage that power in a way that benefits the people who've given it to you. We don't really have the mechanisms in our society today to see how people are actually using our power until it's too late, because everyone has a good story to tell. We master the story, and we master the image and the illusion of that story, and therefore we can get caught up in how we like someone, their personality, how they dress, their manners, and not look at, well, okay, that's all fine. How did they use this power? For us or against us? And we have a hard time, if we like the person like Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, and then look at, or Ronald Reagan, and then look at what they actually did and who it benefited, and the majority of people were not benefited, actually hurt. Your thoughts, please.
Well, this is a very important issue. I want to add to what Jim said first, and then I'll come to it. One of the things about having a story, of course, is that, for example, the United States abroad is thought of by its people as only doing good things, and we very reluctantly get drawn into other people's affairs. But the story that's being told everywhere else in the world is that we're interfering in their affairs and that we have military bases everywhere. And most Americans don't know it, but as of 2 or 3 years ago, we had 800 military bases around the world. If you asked most Americans, they'd say, oh, maybe a dozen. And the difference between 800 military bases and a dozen is pretty profound. Well, what's happening now even more is the national security state that's being built up under Obama, of all people, has probably got another 100 lily pad bases, very tiny little military bases, usable for hop, skip, and a jump use by secret military forces, and the national security state actually gets to have assassination programs that are made easier and so on. And we're being regarded by the rest of the world as unfair, contrary to what Jim says is what's going on. The Americans think of themselves as having a fair society in respect to the rest of the world, and then suddenly the rest of the world regards us as unfair. So the unfairness that we perceive at home in terms of economic inequality and so on has to do mostly with the unfairness of multinational corporations and multinational enterprises. The issue that I want to highlight here is that a global system is in the process of emerging. First we had global markets. Now we're having globalized military power, and we're having a globalized media culture such that we start perceiving other people elsewhere in the world as real people, and that's got positive aspects to it, but we sometimes hate the way they actually act and so on because we were ignorant about it before. So 2 or 3 things are happening at once. One, we're getting into great danger across the entire planet from climate change, and they're going to have to deal with that. And so we're having major disruptions, major droughts, major problems with all fossil fuels, gasoline and coal in particular. And we're having floods and wild weather, and the Arctic ice is melting and the Greenland ice is melting. So instead of sea levels rising a century from now, they're going to rise in the next decade, and it's not going to be very pretty because most of the ports or seaports are going to probably drown. So we're getting into a time of a cascade of crises, and what happens when you've got a system of warfare set up such that the story we tell ourselves is we're just protecting our interests abroad or we're just helping out, but the story of everybody else is that we're coercing them in the middle of using a crisis to and being in the middle of various environmental crises or crises like the Arab Spring to kill people off and to take them down, take their governments down. So the power of conflicting stories is a very important one. So the issue that you raise is very important from a very particular viewpoint, and that's a cultural viewpoint. We tend to think of American culture as one thing. Actually, today, what my values research showed over the last 25 years is that today we have 3 competing subcultures in the United States. A very traditional subculture that wants to act as if it was still the 19th century, that what happened 100 years to 150 years ago is still good. And a modernist culture that acts like getting ahead is the most important thing, me first kind of stuff. The traditional culture is about 1/4 of the population, and for some purposes as little as 20%, for others as much as 30%, but that's about it. And the moderns are somewhere around 40%, and then the remainder are people who are creating a new culture. That's why I call them cultural creatives. And the cultural creatives are very aware of the planet. The traditionals are very aware of their own religion and their own region, but are very, very provincial. And the moderns are nationalists, needless to say. And the thing that's about story is that the dominant stories of our society right now, at this minute, are being told by a media that's almost entirely, like 99%, modernist. That is, getting ahead is most important. Power and wealth are most important. You should have a sense of awe for the rich. Your organization's like a machine, and so is your body, and like that. But what we've got is a third group, the cultural creatives, who are seeing the planet. They know the planet's in trouble. They take leadership on these issues. They're also for personal growth and development over their entire lifetime. They're also for alternative health care, and their most important opinion leaders are women. So women's issues are very much to the forefront, and they're about 35%. Now, the thing that's interesting about that, as part of the globalization trend, is it's 35% cultural creatives across Western Europe and 35% in Japan, where other people have done studies just like mine. And so it's a big number. And it's a possibility for positive change, just as there's a possibility for very negative change with militarized responses to climate crises and financial crises and so on. So, but Jim's point about the convergence of wealth and power is the great issue of today. The modernist society, when it gets in trouble, starts consolidating power. And it's felt as unfair by all the poorer people. It's felt as unfair by all the minor ethnic groups. And it's felt as unfair by people who are not part of American society elsewhere in the world is also unfair. Each subculture has its own way of talking about what's unfair. So conservative Roman Catholics and conservative religious fundamentalists like Mormons and Southern Baptists have their stories about what's unfair. Moderns, who are either business conservatives or liberals, it doesn't matter which, have their stories about what's unfair, and the cultural creatives have yet another story about what's unfair. And we all have cultural symbols that are different from one another. So right now, part of what's going on is the cacophony of voices we've got is really putting us in a difficult interpretation situation. It's hard to tell what the heck is going on. And so that's confusion gives a cover for power to go even farther, even faster. And I'll let my stuff stop there for the moment.
Really appreciate, Paul, your overview. Now, Jim, I'm going to ask you to look at the different pieces of the puzzle I'm putting in front of you. They all connect, but I would like to see how you would connect them. Let's start with something Paul said, that when people in positions of power or institutions, which are just people also, when they feel threatened on any level, they consolidate their power. They even become more assertive and more aggressive and more protective of that. Now, that's one piece. In this current environment we're in, we have a dichotomy. On the one hand, we have those who have been given the power politically are the corporatist Republicans and corporatist Democrats. And there's very little difference between the two. They may think and talk a little differently on some issues, but they still serve the same larger interest, the multinational global elite. But the conservatives will say we want smaller government, and yet they have overseen the largest military-industrial complex in history. They have overseen the largest socialized programs for corporate interest ever. They have overseen the offshoring of profits from made in other countries, which are anywhere between $21 and $33 trillion, and because they don't want to pay American taxes on that. And they also have overseen the largest outsourcing of jobs in American history, but also in corporations. 58,000 factories have closed since 2000. They oversaw the complete artificial bubble of the real estate market, the commercial real estate market, the hedge fund market, the equity partnership market, and the enormous amount of bubble in the student educational arena, especially in the for-profit educational arena. They take no responsibility for any of this. The Democrats, the historical Democrats, will say we're for the people, we're for unions, we're for the poor, and it was under Clinton the evisceration of, at one time, a model welfare program, putting many people at risk of losing the small margins that they could hold on to for food and financial security. And then they allow all the constitutional grabbing, the evisceration of our habeas corpus. They have executive orders that have been put in place that they have not challenged. And so they allow corruption to go unchecked. And the first thing this president does when he gets into office say, let's look ahead, not behind. And I'm thinking, well, what if you, Jim Garrison, went out today and robbed a bank, and then you robbed 20 banks, and a year from now you're caught, and you say to the prosecutor, let's put all these things behind us. Let's look forward. and the hypocrisy of it is just, it's palpable, and yet the consequence of these people being wrong are substantial. Now, one more piece of the puzzle. Right now, you mentioned the amount of, or I think Paul did, how many military garrisons around the world. We just did a report on this, and it was a little over 1,020. Some of these have been in place since in Germany and Japan since the end of the Second World War. And then you ask all the current scholars, I mean independent scholars, what is the major reason for terrorism? And it's the occupation of their country is the primary reason for terrorism. Then you ask, why are we in the Pacific? Why are we trying to usurp power in Syria? Wasn't it Syria and wasn't Lebanon and wasn't Libya and Iraq part of that original group that we wanted to take power from? Well, what's this going to do if we bomb or allow Israel to bomb with our support or NATO support, which is our support, Iran? Within 24 hours, do you not think that they're going to retaliate against their enemy? Worse enemy than Israel is Saudi Arabia, and detonate those oil fields, block the straits so no oil can go in and out, and 60% of the world's oil goes into there. Overnight speculation is going to, and supply and demand is going to cause the price of oil to go to $300 a barrel, $15 to $20 a gallon. What in the world does anyone think that would do to our economy, let alone other economies in the world, for travel, for getting food to places? And then wouldn't China then say, we don't need to fight you militarily. You owe us too much. We can just cripple America and win any war by saying we're no longer going to hold your dollars, drop the dollars they have because they've already been secretly doing it, building their 17 phantom cities that hold 65 million unused places and buying all this land in South America and Africa. They could destroy us financially. They could cause the dollar no longer be the reserve currency. The BRIC nations have backed them up. 23 Central and South American nations already are trading in their own currencies. So overnight, in 24 hours, is it not possible the United States could cease to be what it has always claimed to be, a real power, and become a fiat power except for militarily? And yet no one in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, none of the major stations, none of the major journals are ever challenging the idea that the President of the United States, sucking up to Israel and the neocons in America and the special interest, is not aware of this or looking ahead to say what is the likely outcome for the rest of us, and then to make sure he has power. And this goes back to something Paul said. What does this president do? This president, Barack Obama. Well, how about his so-called national emergency plans, where the Secretary of Defense has all the power over our water resources. The Secretary of Commerce has power over our material services and facilities, including construction materials. The Secretary of Transportation has power over all forms of civilian transportation. The Secretary of Agriculture has power over every single piece of food and facilities, livestock, and planet health resources, domestic distribution. The Health and Human Service Secretary has power over all health resources. Secretary of Energy has power over all of our energy forms. And this is all through Executive Order 13618, in effect power over all of our communication resources, including the Internet. Literally, we would become a complete prison nation where no dissent of any form, either Internet, verbal over the radio, anything in writing would be tolerated. You'd be subject to the National Defense Authorization provisions where you could be disappeared with no habeas corpus. This is the Democrat official, corporate Democrats president. This is what's been going on, and now that is the final piece of this puzzle, just those scenarios on the pathology of power.
That from a constitutional lawyer, for heaven's sake.
Yes, that's quite a litany, Gary. Every time I interact with you on one of your shows, I'm just very struck by your encyclopedic command of what's actually going on. And I just, in the first instance, I just wanted to commend you on that. I think what you're doing is such a service to the little democracy we have left. I would make two comments. One is just to recall Marx for a moment. You know, Marx made the point about monopoly capitalism, that what causes the system to completely implode, and that's what we're beginning to watch in America, is that he says when the governing elites concentrate sufficient political and economic power, which is what monopoly capitalism implies, he says at a certain point just pure greed takes over and the system begins to consume itself through irrationality, as he put it. And I think anybody looking at the statistics that you just laid out, how could a constitutional lawyer preside over the complete evisceration of the Bill of Rights and our constitutional processes? How could the United States, in the name of freedom, have over 1,000 bases? And as Paul mentioned, the unique contribution of Barack Obama is these little lily pad bases and covert operations by the hundreds happening on a weekly and monthly basis all over the world. It's because that the system itself has become so corrupted that the system itself has become irrational. And there is no longer any direct causality as one would expect in a democratic system where your civic institutions are operating. And I think the additional point that I would make is that I think what we've seen in the last, I would say, a couple of years, culminating in the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act and this year's executive order about emergency preparation, is the confluence of the military-industrial complex and the war on terror on the one side, and the corporate takeover of politics in America on the other side. When Eisenhower warned Americans in the 1950s as he was departing from office about the dangers of the military-industrial complex, we had a political system that was still working in more or less a viable way, which means that we had mediating institutions set up largely by Roosevelt in the New Deal, where the excesses of the Wall Street barons and even the excesses of the military-industrial complex were modified because of a institutional process of governance that kept the excesses in check. And what we've seen now with the recent enactments by huge majorities in the Congress around the evisceration of the Bill of Rights and the constitutional checks and balances now is a system that has gone completely out of control. And so I think we're in a situation, it's not unlike, at some point with the Nazis, where the thing begins to consume itself and no longer are rational decisions being made by anybody other than decisions within that chaotic process of intense personal greed and personal power. And so I think we're in an extraordinary situation. The other piece that I would put, which speaks to the other side of what Paul's saying, Paul's making the point that 30% of the American, European, and Japanese public are cultural creatives. They understand the need for environmental protection. They understand the importance of community. They embrace technology and economic well-being, but only within mediating institutions where equity equitable distribution of wealth and protection of the environment can be secured. What makes a revolution happen in a culture is when power gets so distended as we're seeing today in America, and more people get alienated. At some point, something happens that is generally very insignificant at the time, and the entire thing explodes. Let me give just a quick example. Mubarak in Egypt had been standing supreme for decades, and there were some food riots the beginning of last year in Egypt that didn't have any apparent connection with the regime. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came a cascade of events that moved so fast that within literally 30 days, Mubarak was under house arrest. And I believe that we need to self-consciously be aware that we're in a pre-revolutionary situation where the institutions are so out of kilter, the elites are consumed by their greed, the masses of people are alienated, and we're in this kind of almost like a Bardol state where any movement now at any place in the system can trigger huge events, as a result of which the entire system could very easily spin out of control. So I state this because at one level it looks like the United States has got 1,000 bases, it's got an air force, it's got nuclear weapons, it seems to control the global economy, but underneath it there's a vulnerability that is creeping in and corroding the system, and the center is not holding, and we're liable to see something happen in the next month or year or 2 years where the entire edifice could collapse by its own weight.
You're familiar with Hannah's writings of 1951, her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, aren't you? Oh,
yeah, and the banality of power, of evil.
In my personal opinion, she is one of the single most important, insightful investigators, and one reason I believe Chris Hedges quotes her on her so frequently, and especially noteworthy, is her chapter on the political emancipation of the bourgeois and her treatment of Thomas Hobbes, who she called the fully recognized philosopher of the bourgeois. And some of the things that she highlights that I would accept is that the elite, when it arises from a new class, as we see now in the United States in the last 20 years, where we have 10 million millionaires and we have 1,000 billionaires or close to it, they become the anti-traditionalist. And that existence is completely tied up with property. And that property, she calls us, is the dynamic new property producing device. And she believed that the so-called accumulation of capital, which gave birth to the bourgeois, which are the oligarchical elite of today, changed the very conception of property and wealth became a never-ending process of getting wealthier. And the acquisition of wealth as a never-ending process is guaranteed only by the seizure of political power. Hence, if you want more of anything, you have to have power, and therefore you align yourselves with people who are powerful, and then at one point you become an infinitesimal percentage of the population, but you have the vast majority of its power. And so she saw this new body of politic that emerged around the machine of acquiring and controlling wealth as tyrannical to society and, in effect, adulterous. And she also was cognizant of a totalitarianism relying upon what she called the front organizations, the fake government agencies. Well, gee whiz, look how many of those, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, all the groups that the left has refused to acknowledge or recognize. On MSNBC, you never hear them talking about the Bilderbergs. And if you do, it's always with some disdain and condescension towards those who have in any way had a legitimate challenge to it. As if, oh, well, you know, the head of The Nation magazine is on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations, so it couldn't be bad. And instead of looking at these as non-elected institutions that are there to serve the needs of the two major parties, and the two major parties are there to serve the needs of the 12 to 1,500 major corporations, and for that, the families and individuals who control them. Could you deal with this, especially if you read her Race and Bureaucracy, where she said totalitarianism is never content to rule by external means, namely through the state and machinery of violence, thanks to his peculiar ideology and the role assigned to it. And his apparatus of coercion and totalitarianism has discovered a means of dominating and terrorizing human beings from within. Could you deal with this as it applies to us today, some half-century after she wrote that?
Paul, do you want to take a cut at it?
Paul?
Do you want me to?
I'm sitting here listening to you guys talk, and I'm reminded of a book that came out when we were all graduate students called Becoming Caesars by Amaury de Riencourt. And, you know, things could either fall apart chaotically, or you could have a succession of moves to take away any democratic participation and consolidate totalitarian power, because the idea that the center cannot hold is one idea, and that's something that strikes fear into the hearts of a lot of people. But the other alternative is to say you're going to be looking at a situation where a power grab occurs, backed up by the military in the name of keeping order, backed up by the holders of wealth in the name of keeping property under proper control, and it starts looking like ancient Rome, and it starts looking like Caesarism. And Caesarism is essentially the state religion and the state politics backed up by the military. And it's all too ugly and all too obvious. And at some point, what you're getting into is a series of consolidating moves by people who appear to be at opposite ends of the spectrum, like Romney and Obama, but they're both in effect pawns of a huge system, intricately complex at many levels, too complex for people to understand, and it has its own inertia, its own momentum, and inertia against certain kinds of change, but momentum for another kind of consolidating change. And that's the risk we run right now, is that no matter who comes into power, whether it's through the official denizen of Wall Street like Romney, or somebody who appears to be separate from Wall Street but has big backing from Wall Street bankers like Obama. And you know, the problem that we've got is that the locus of control is moving out of Washington and New York into a non-place realm of international planetary relationships, where we're getting a planetary elite that's not responsible to anybody. And that's what is outside the range of what most people can think in terms of right now. Hannah Arendt was concerned only with the nation state. What we're looking at is a system in the process of emerging and merging that could be really, really ugly, or it could have major potential for going on to the next higher level of civilization. Unfortunately, in the presence of a lot of chaotic breakdowns, what's most likely is the desire to hold power by violence.
Well, Paul, let me ask...
we're going to keep coming back to that again and again and again.
Paul, let me ask you a follow-up to that you just made, and thank you for that insight. You're both familiar with Norman Cousins, and I work with Cousins at one point, and of course he was the author of the book back in the 1980s, Pathology of Power. His philosophy was that you use power to drive intelligence underground, and using power to become a theology, as it were, that criminalizes deviance. And of course, who determines what is deviant? Those in power. And therefore, you protest anything that is not considered an ideological norm. So the left has become ideologized, completely idealized, as has the right. And so Chris Hedges, or both of you, or probably 5,000 or 10,000 other people we know who are really progressives, now we won't be given a forum. It's driven underground. And what we would consider a legitimate challenge is no longer tolerated. And only if you're willing to come to them to talk about things that enhance them, praise them, adulate them, are you given any credibility for having a mind. Everything else is just swept aside. That said, I believe that there's two dynamics happening simultaneously. The one that the major media is trying to protect and support, and that is in the government in Greece, the government in Spain, both of which are conservative, are saying yes to all the demands of the international banking community, the European National, or the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. We'll give you back all the money. Of course, that money stays with them. But behind that is a second reality that's not even being focused on. The amount of deprivation and suffering happening to people, and now at certain points it will tip. Now, when it will tip, we don't know. I could assume that in Greece it will tip first, and it'll probably tip in the next 6 months or so. In Spain, it'll probably take within a year, but once it tips, you can't put it back. It's not coming back. It's like us going above 2 degrees, 2 degrees in our temperature. It's not going to come back. We're going to lose an awful lot of what happens in this world if it goes 2 degrees hotter. And then the people in power who only represent the special interest groups, they're going to be thrown out. No more payments of bills to the ruling oligarchy, and I see class warfare going on in those societies. None of this is being discussed. All that's discussed now is, gee whiz, can they pay back the money? They cannot pay back. Should we give more loans? What's this doing to Germany's credit rating? Oh, gee whiz, they just downgraded it to from conservative to not worthy, as far as their long-term future in these. And we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about not a rating, and we're talking about democracies that are going to become extremely violent. They're going to become very, very intolerant of people in power who have used them and abused them. And then the whole world is going to say, especially the United States and Canada and England and France, gee whiz, that's bad. We better give more power to the police, more power to the states, so we don't have any of that looting and burning and problem in our society. Would you follow up on this, Paul?
What's to follow up? It seems to me that's an open and shut case. It's a very difficult thing to face up to. It's as unpleasant a possible reality as anything we can think of, and yet it seems all too likely. And one of the things you're leaving out, of course, is that the people who are the most forward-thinking don't have weapons, and the people who are the most backward-thinking, the traditionals, are the ones who have all the guns. So the chances of an imposition of stronger state power is likely to be met by traditionals belonging to the NRA in the United States. And so the question will then be, what's the dynamic, what's the scenario that unfolds at that point? Do they become co-opted into a militia and turned against the Mexicans and the blacks, which I suspect would be the easy way out for the elites in power? So you divert them away from whatever they are complaining about, but you certainly don't let them use their guns in a random fashion. So it would be a very, very ugly scenario, but all too likely. It's very, very troublesome. The devolution into violence, the control, counter-control dynamic is one that breaks down rather rapidly. If that happens, and it may be a when that happens for all I know, then you've got the conditions of chaos, deprivation, blasted hopes, sense of the world's going to hell in a handbasket, I've got to get mine before it's too late, all those kinds of patterns. as a mass response. Part of the issue is also the question of what's going on with the media. Part of the question that we have to look at is the feedback mechanisms we're given about what's going on in our world. Fox News, of course, is a source of right-wing, massive deception. It's hard to know where they would end up on that one, probably with the business conservatives rather than the violent traditionals, but it's hard to know. And right now we've got a media that's giving us bad information. They're trying to show us what's going on by adjusting the rear view mirror because they can't steer the car. But they're deeply committed to looking into what's been happening over the last few months and never looking forward because they're afraid to get slammed and knocked down over it because it looks really bad.
Jim, final question. Do you believe that that we are capable in this country, at least the poor working class, that will probably be with some smattering of the intellectuals and creatives, to offer a legitimate challenge to those who have used and abused our power? And just what Paul was saying, if you go to Detroit, where I was recently, that's what you see. People, the average price of a house in Detroit now is $6,000. Half the city's population is gone. Crime is through the roof. And yet there are rich little pockets, like Grosse Pointe, where people have to be fearful of a carjacking to get into it. Now they feel they're in this little enclaves. And all across America, you're seeing more and more of the hyper-securitization of gated communities and like green zones. Like Manhattan would be a green zone, but Queens, Bronx, Brooklyn would not be. Certain parts of Westchester would be, L.A., certain parts, but the rest wouldn't be. Is that what we're becoming? What will the people do? What should they do? What are your solutions? The final thoughts here in the last 4 minutes or yours, 5 minutes.
Well, I must say, Gary, that I'm very pessimistic about the capacity of the public in America, the downtrodden and the dispossessed, given the lock that the corporate, political, and media elites have on their information and capacity to actually exercise power for them to do anything. I mean, I watched, as we all did, with extraordinary respect and enthusiasm for the Occupy movement, and then we watched equally come November, December, for how the government basically eliminated them from their occupations, literally in an orchestrated move across the nation. And so I can identify precious few examples in history where once a country or an empire concentrates power like is concentrated in the United States, and the breakdown of civic institutions and patriotism comes to such a level where a country has ever kind of brought itself back up. There are a few examples, but they're precious few. And what tends to happen in these kinds of situations is exactly what we just saw in Egypt. That once the system gets so corrupted, there can be a democratic almost spasm, as we saw in Tahrir Square, but very quickly and ruthlessly, as Paul indicated, the military and political elites will adapt, and as we're seeing in Egypt today, even with presidential elections, the military is still quite firmly in control. We may see a civil war, we may see a breakdown, but we're not seeing democracy. That's the point. So that would be the first comment I would make. The second comment I would make is that I think that people have to understand the gravity of this political situation and increasing escalation of the climate change situation and begin to come together in community. I think the question is less how are we going to change the United States of America and seize power from Wall Street or the Homeland Security than it is how do we as a small community come together in a way that will give us a sense of identity, security, and empowerment at the local level. Many, many communities are going off-grid. The transition movement that started in England over 10 years ago is now spreading around the United States and Europe. Wisdom University is building community. I think that we have to be ruthlessly realistic about the gravity of the situation, and what that means is that we shouldn't waste any more time than we have to trying to change a system that is already beyond redemption. And so that if it's the case that the Republicans and the Democrats are equally corrupted, and it actually doesn't make any difference whether Romney or Obama is president of the United States, then that leaves people of goodwill with some very narrow choices around how to actually protect themselves and build community in the midst of an escalating and increasingly chaotic situation.
Well, Jim, let's do this because we're out of time for this program. Let us have another show on the Progressive Commentary Hour where we just focus upon positive solutions for the transformation that is inevitable in the very near future is going to happen. So we give people an hour discussion on just that topic.
With pleasure.
Paul, both of you will be invited back. I thank you both very much. And the website is wisdomuniversity.org. And Paul, your website, please?
culturalcreatives.org.
Thank you both very much for being here today.
Thank you.
I'm Gary Null. That completes our Progressive Commentary Hour.